Thank you. The Beit Din will now hear your case. Mr. Shalom, please explain your situation.
A few months ago, I was driving down a New York City road when all of a sudden a car came from the adjacent lane, swerved, T-boning my car. Not only was my car severely damaged, but I suffered extensive injury. I spent months in the hospital, during which I endured a painful recovery and was unable to work. I come before you today to charge Mr. Rubenstein, the owner of the swerving car, to pay for the damage to my car, all of my medical bills, and the wages I lost during the weeks I could not work.
Thank you, Mr. Shalom. Mr. Rubenstein, please state your case.
I was using my self-driving car from the company Yeshiva to run errands. The car is completely autonomous, and I have no ability to manually intervene with its driving. I was just as surprised as Mr. Shalom was when my car suddenly swerved. I feel bad for what happened, but it wasn't my fault. Though I wasn't completely aware of it at the time, my car swerved to avoid hitting and killing a jaywalking pedestrian. If anything, then, it should be the pedestrian's fault.
But he disappeared into the crowd. He can't be traced to pay my damages, and someone must be held accountable to pay.
Well, the case against the pedestrian is indeed a good one. Let me ask you something, Mr. Rubenstein. Did this pedestrian directly cause the damage to Mr. Shalom and his car?
Well, no. I guess my car directly caused the damage by swerving into Mr. Shalom's car.
Well then, the pedestrian's act was one of grama. Because his action only indirectly caused the damage, he cannot be held liable to pay.
But is there not something called garmi, which is certain types of indirect damages that one would have to pay for? Did the pedestrian's actions count as garmi?
Garma cases are similar to grama cases, but they differ in two major ways. The first is that the damager directly touches another's property but causes indirect damages. Mr. Rubenstein, did the pedestrian touch your car?
No, I assume he simply activated some sensor in my autonomous car that caused it to swerve. He never actually touched the car. If he had, he probably would have been killed.
And you, Mr. Shalom, did the pedestrian directly cause the damage to your car?
No, he did not.
Mr. Rubenstein, you mentioned sensors, though it works against you. According to Rav Tzvi Kushelevsky, quoting the opinion of Shilti Hagiborim, when a person walks in front of a sensor, the action is not of triggering the sensor, but simply of walking. Because the pedestrian's involvement in the damage was completely indirect, it is not garmi, but grama, and he cannot be held liable for damages. As Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, applying a ruling of the Rashba, writes, simply walking in front of a sensor without the intention of activating it would be an act of grama. The second distinguishing factor of a garmi case is that garmi actions are considered exploitable, and the Beit Din must be able to hold people accountable for trying to bypass responsibility for damage.
This is not the case. If the pedestrian could have guessed that jaywalking would put his life in danger and cause a car accident, he never would have stepped into the street. This is New York City. Everyone jaywalks here. No one purposely intends to cause an accident. Had Ms. Rubenstein been in control of her car, she would have known to watch for jaywalkers.
So because the pedestrian's act was indirect, it's considered grama and he can't be liable to pay?
Correct.
So what about Yeshiva, the car company? Shouldn't it be their fault that my car swerved and hit Mr. Shalom's car? They programmed the car. I really had nothing to do with the crash and couldn't have stopped it. Is this not Yeshiva's fault? I was forced by the car's programming to crash into Mr. Shalom's car.
When reviewing this case, we placed a call to the CEO of Yeshiva, Mr. Eli Levine, and he stands by his product. He explained that the car is programmed to make the decision that minimizes the risks of fatalities, and swerving to him, Mr. Shalom, was the safest choice.
Still, I never signed any contract relieving Yeshiva of the responsibility for the car, so how can I be held responsible?
Yes, but halacha honors a sale. Unless you were misled about the car's functions and risks, that sale is valid, and the car is your property and your responsibility. Did you know that the car was completely autonomous when you bought it?
Yeah, it has no manual override. I purchased it because I wanted the freedom to do other things while driving, like listening to my podcasts.
Do you believe that the car functioned correctly in swerving to avoid hitting the pedestrian and instead hitting Mr. Shalom's car?
I mean, at the speed the car was going, it probably would have killed the pedestrian if it hit him, but I would have just braked.
Perhaps, but you were not the one in control of the car. Mr. Eli Levine maintains that the car calculates the best decisions, and had it braked, the pedestrian would have been killed.
I guess the car did make the right choice. I wouldn't have bought the car if I didn't feel confident in its ability to make the right choices. The car did function exactly as it should have after all. It's not as if it malfunctioned.
In that case, since you bought the car understanding it would make the best choice for you, and since the car functioned exactly as it was supposed to, the sale was valid. From a halachic perspective, the car is yours, and you're responsible for it.
Shouldn't we discuss Leva's programming, though? It caused me much pain and damage. Perhaps we ought to ask Mr. Levine to work on changing it to be more safe.
It is indeed unfortunate that you were on the wrong end of Oliva's decisions. However, we have reviewed Mr. Levine's claims and believe that the car did indeed function to minimize risks. Killing the pedestrian was a certainty, while your death was very unlikely. In such a case of vadai versus safek, of a certainty versus doubt, it is proper to take the path of least destruction.
I understand that. So will Miss Rubenstein be paying me?
But was this entire situation one of onus?
Well, the Gemara claims that all man is muad le'olam, meaning man is inherently dangerous, and the Ramban holds that this is even true in cases of onus. Though the Tosfot brings an exemption for cases of onus gamor, we believe that car accidents, even to avoid pedestrians, are common enough not to be considered onus, and definitely not onus gamor. Ms. Rubenstein therefore is responsible. Additionally, she was the one to start the car and set its axles into motion, and the Pitre Choshen cites the Rash, saying that one who directly cites a series of actions in motion is responsible. The Rambam also rules that one who damages intentionally, as the car did do to save the pedestrian, and in a public domain, is responsible. Despite doing the right thing, Ms. Rubenstein is liable.
But technically it was the car that did the damaging. Isn't that equivalent to an animal that damages and therefore reduces my responsibility?
Actually, the Rash brings a case of a horse and a rider, and ruled that the horse was merely an extension of the rider, since the rider directs the horse. This applies to today's modern vehicles as well, according to contemporary sources. This damage is not categorized as an animal's damage. It is also not categorized as a fire's damage because the car functioned deliberately as programmed by a human, and no outside forces were involved. Rather, this is Adam Hamazik, and even with Kavana Lahazik, with intention to damage, since the car did intend to hit Mr. Shalom. As illustrated in the Gemara's example of a man accidentally falling a roof, but then intentionally angling to land on another person, the falling man is responsible to pay full damages to the person he fell on, even though the intent only came about because of an unforeseeable circumstance. That is, you are considered the damaging entity. Halachically speaking, you did the damage and you are responsible.
But the car only swerved to save a life. What about the concept of lo tamod al damar yafa? Isn't there an idea that you can go to any extent to save someone's life, even by stealing or damaging someone else's property?
That is correct. However, the rescuer must also pay back for whatever damage he caused while saving someone else's life. So even if you are obligated to do the damage, you are also obligated to pay for it.
But then isn't Mr. Shalom also obligated in saving the pedestrian?
How would I be responsible? You were the one who would have hit him.
Ms. Rubenstein is correct, actually. Since you were in the next lane over, and Mrs. Rubenstein had to crash into you to save the pedestrian's life, she required your cooperation. So you too had a responsibility to the life of the pedestrian. One is required to incur financial loss and damages to save a life, and you share that obligation with Ms. Rubenstein.
Does that mean I will not get any compensation from Miss Rubenstein? It was not even my choice.
You have an obligation, but so does Ms. Rubenstein. Therefore, the price will be split. Ms. Rubenstein will pay for half of the damages to your car and for half of your lost wages.
What about my medical bills?
Here, there's a distinction. While one is obligated to incur financial damage, he is not required to incur personal injury. Ms. Rubenstein, even if making the correct decision to save the pedestrian, forced you to do something you did not have to do. Therefore, she will pay you back completely for your medical bills.
If I had no obligation to incur injury, why was I obligated to total my car? That was a direct cause of the injury. I shouldn't have to pay for any part of my car.
That is true. Had you been making the decision, you would not have been obligated to damage your car and risk your body. However, once a decision was already made for you, the car's damage and the injury are no longer connected. The same applies to your lost wages, which were a result of an injury you did not have to suffer, but after the fact, they're no longer related.
Can we work this out through insurance? I would get much more benefits.
But using insurance would raise my premiums. Am I obligated to use it, or can I pay on my own?
Since using insurance is nowadays part of the rules of the road, at Mr. Shalom's request, Ms. Rubenstein could be obligated to use insurance. Should both parties agree, we may also mediate a compromise to satisfy both parties. To conclude, we the Beit Din reiterate our ruling. Based on applied halachic principles, we obligate Ms. Rubenstein, as the Adam Hamazik, to pay the medical bills, half of Mr. Shalom's lost wages, and half the damage to Mr. Shalom's car. We obligate Mr. Shalom to pay the remaining amount to fix his car and to incur the remaining loss of wages. Should insurance be an issue, we will mediate a pshara, a compromise between the parties. Additionally, we do not recommend Aliva to alter their programming and believe it acted properly to save a life.
Thank you very much for hearing our case.
Thank you for your fair judgment.
Can you leave it up for a sec?
Oh, sure, sorry. I had like these blue things that disappeared. Thank you.
Okay. So the biggest question for me is the inability to assign, or what you see as the inability to assign Garmy to the jaywalker. It seems you do that based on an assumption that the jaywalker did not intend to have anything bad happen. Now, you assume this is in New York.
It was given in the Q&A.
Oh, it's given in the Q&A, okay. Is it possible, or perhaps even likely, that the jaywalker had other intent?
It is possible. The main distinction between Grama and Garmy is that in Garmy, the jaywalker would directly touch the car. He doesn't do this. He only activates a sensor, which we read
Right.
most post-game say that is not direct. That's just an act of walking, and then he happens to trigger the sensor.
What's the context in which those post-game talk about the sensors? What are they are they trying to figure out
I
halachically?
think they were actually talking about cameras, and in regards to Shabbat, if it would be muktzah to activate a sensor. And they ruled that an act of walking in front of a sensor is it's really just walking. You don't intend to trigger the sensor. You may not know there's a sensor. So the act is not of triggering a sensor, but it's an act of walking. Another distinction between Garmi and Grama is not necessarily that there is a distinction, but that there are certain common actions that could be abused, in which people would try to damage indirectly and get out of paying, and Beit Din has to be able to hold that accountable. So for certain actions, they would be required to pay, but we don't believe that jaywalking is an exploitable action in order to damage a car. No one really intends to jaywalk and purposely cause an accident, not feasibly anyways, so.
So basically, the exemption, the Garmi is meant to kind of limit the application of grama so that people can't abuse
Yes.
grama. Okay. Yeah.
Because, so one case that's brought up in Bava Kama is if you drop a jug off, or throw a jug off of a roof and someone breaks it on the way down, you can't really obligate either party, because one of them is breaking it while one person can say it was going to break 100%, and the other person can say the other person broke it. So that action like that, where it would be, if people could do that to abuse the system, you could get away with breaking someone's object for free. So Garmi exists in order to prevent actions of doing that, where you could break someone's object without having to pay at all.
You talk about the horse and the driver, and how the driver is responsible for the horse's actions, but in this case, Rachel's not actually driving the car. So how is it that you can use this argument to hold her responsible?
So we assume that since this sale was valid, that she assumes full responsibility for the car. It's as if they're her actions.
And also, so if the car behaved in a manner that was not expected of it, so like it did something that was not supposed to, then she could go after Leva and find them faulty for something. But since she bought the car and the car behaved exactly as it was supposed to, that's why it works.
When you were talking about ones, you mentioned the idea of Adamu ad olam, and then you said that that was kind of nullified by the fact that pedestrians are relatively common. So you're considering the pedestrian to be a ruach mitzuyah?
Yes.
Okay. And so then wouldn't that kind of contradict the, I'm getting too many double negatives here. Wouldn't that then kind of eliminate the argument that it's onus for Mr. Rubenstein?
Right. So when we considered ONAS, we figured this was a situation where pedestrian jaywalked, car did this because that's what it was programmed to do. Not necessarily the car forced Ms. Rubenstein, but the situation forced the car and therefore Ms. Rubenstein to do what it did. Was that onus? So we concluded it is not, because car accidents happen with enough frequency that.
Okay, so because it is ruach mitzuyah, onus doesn't apply. Okay. I can't help it. I have to go back to the sensors thing. So your sources, the makorot that you're using as the basis for the sensors argument, is that our makorot that deal with Shabbat and being and violating and doing a malacha on Shabbat,
Correct.
right? And so those perspectives have those makorot would seem to have. Well, first of all, I'm not sure that they're comparable situations, right? Because you have a ritual halacha for Shabbat there, and here we're dealing with Nezikin, which is a little different. But you're in a position where you want the person to not be responsible. You're trying to find a way for them not to be responsible. And my question is, can you not say that in this case, a sensor, I mean, just the word sensor, literally is similar to what the touching would be, right? When one person touches another, that other person is sensing that touch, right? And so even though he might have not have had physical direct contact with the car as a pedestrian, could you not make the claim that the pedestrian, by getting in the car's space, essentially causing the sensors to pick up on his presence, right? Essentially touching the car, is then responsible for causing the car to then move into Mr. Rubenstein's car to then move into Mr. Shalom's car.
So what these sources are saying, definitely the situations are not comparable. Shabbat and Ezekiel, they're two different things. But the definition of the act of walking in front of a sensor and triggering it, how do we define that act? And these sources define that simply as an act of walking and not as an act of triggering the sensor. I think primarily because it's not always known that there's a sensor, but you're not doing touching.
Let's go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, first of all, thank you so much to our judges. Thank you to all the teams whose hard work, it was obvious, the effort you put in and the great jobs you did up here. We happen to be done, the judges are going to deliberate now. We happen to be done before other groups. You're welcome to go around. Please make sure if you want to move in other groups, you may, but only walk in during a break time, so you don't interrupt in the middle of what's going on. Next thing that's on the schedule, I think, is 12:15.
Before you guys
Oh,
go,
I'm so sorry.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for all the work that you guys have put into this. Reading the case and the arguments was so interesting and so intriguing. And as me in my role that I currently hold, and as a day school graduate who knows that my graduating class could never have done this kind of work, I was so impressed and touched by the work that you guys did. And the oral arguments and the displays that you did and the thoughtfulness with which you answered, you should really be proud of the work that you put into all of